All right, guys. Continuing on with abnormal, with all these psychological disorders, the next thing that I'm going to talk about are depressive disorders. Um, and this is something I know well because I fight depression. I deal with depression. There are other people in my family who also deal with it. Um, but depressive disorders, I deal with a depressed mood or a loss of interest in things or pleasure in things. Um, and somebody might typically in the past have enjoyed. So like if I ever I love sports, I love basketball to death. If I ever were to not enjoy basketball anymore, not have any joy or pleasure out of it, then I would say yeah, I'm definitely would be depressed. Or in some kind of sports, or if I'd never enjoyed I don't know, just certain activities, and you can put that in there with any activity that you might enjoy to a huge extent. So, whether it would be something like maybe socializing with friends or just a hobby you've done for years that you love. If you stop doing that, you just have a loss of interest in it. You might very well be depressed to a point. But whenever it comes to depressive disorders, there's different types. And for some reason, it doesn't. Okay, there it is. There's one called major depressive disorder, and that's where somebody has experienced, not expressed, has experienced one or more intense episodes of depression. So it's something that's been recurring, something that's happened multiple times to somebody, and it's like so when it's major depressive. Um, it affects everything you do. You completely lose interest in everything. You have no energy. You have no um, interest in doing anything. You just have a loss of. You're just completely, in a way, to a point, you're impaired. I've seen it with my mom. I've seen it happen with her before, where she's had major depressive disorder. So there's also bipolar disorder. And while I've never been technically diagnosed with this one, I do believe that I have it. But bipolar disorder, that's where you have extreme mood shifts, where you shift between two states, either depressive or manic. Um, Depressive, obviously, loss of appetite, loss of interest in things that you've done before, loss of energy. Whereas manic, you have very high energy, very creative, just like basically all over the place. The complete opposite of being depressed. But there's two types of bipolar. There's bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. In bipolar 1, that's where a person has episodes of mania. Again, with mania, you're excited, you're hyperactive, you're energetic, and then also periods of deep depression. But bipolar 1 is where you experience more mania than depression. You experience both, but it's more so mania than depression. Whereas bipolar 2, where you're mostly depressed, where you're sad, where you're despondent, but you also have some mania as well. In the past, I feel like I've definitely suffered from bipolar 2. My medication has definitely helped out a lot with that. I don't really I don't have those mood swings anymore. You could ask one of my sisters, you could ask my nieces and nephews, and how my moods used to swing whenever I was younger. It used to be really bad to the point where, like, from 1 second I would just go from one extreme to the other. I mean, like, I'd be calm and then I would just go to screaming and yelling at somebody for the dumbest things, the absolute dumbest things. Um, but over the years I've tried different medications, and I found a combination of two that I'm on right now that really helped with that. So for me, while I've never technically been diagnosed with bipolar 2 disorder, I definitely believe that I've had that in the past. But again, that's just where you go back and forth between between mania and depression. Bipolar 1 is more mania, bipolar 2 is more depressive. There's one other type of depressive disorder I want to mention, that's SAD, or seasonal affective disorder. And that's whenever it happens in a specific time of year. So, like in the wintertime, that's whenever seasonal affective disorder would occur. Well, not just the winter, but also the fall. It would start in the fall, but be most prominent in the wintertime. And they associate it with a decrease in sunlight. The more sunlight you get, the more vitamin C you get, the better you technically, on average, would feel. And of course, in the wintertime, in the fall, winter, you experience less sunlight, the days get shorter. So a lot of people will have seasonal affective disorder during this time because they, they have that a lot less exposure to sunlight. Okay, now I'm going to talk about schizophrenia. That's a disorder where you have delusions, where you have hallucinations. Basically, you have a split between thought and emotion. Those two don't match up with one another. You're paranoid. These are different. There's paranoid and there's also catatonic schizophrenia. With paranoid schizophrenia, where you're preoccupied with delusions related to one specific thing, like one specific single thing, whereas catatonic schizophrenia, where you're lost in a stupor, you're very rigid, unresponsive, really mute. So when we see schizophrenia, we see those two main types, whether you're very paranoid or whether you're more catatonic. Whenever it comes to schizophrenia, some people they've found are biologically vulnerable to schizophrenia. So, like for instance, if one identical twin is schizophrenic, the other twin has just under a 50% chance of also being schizophrenic. And there's been an example where there's been quadruplets, and all four had schizophrenia. So, some people are definitely more biologically predisposed to that, more likely to suffer from it. Biologically, very few people with schizophrenia have children. So you might say, okay, well, what? Then if very few people that are schizophrenic have children, how is there a genetic component to it? If a man fathers a child when he is older, the more likely the child will develop the disorder. So, like if you're a man who's older and fathers a child, then that child is more likely to have schizophrenia. Some genetic mutations occur with male reproductive cells and increase the risk of schizophrenia. So there's some different ways that genetics can affect schizophrenia. If you want an example of schizophrenia, you could watch the movie A Beautiful Mind. That will show you somebody with schizophrenia. So if you want like an actual example of somebody that's schizophrenic, look up the movie A Beautiful Mind. There's also two different types of symptoms with schizophrenia. There's positive and there's negative. Positive are symptoms that you actually like exhibit. So like you're delusional, or you have hallucinations, you have disordered behavior, disorganized speech. Whereas you also have negative symptoms of schizophrenia, and that's where you don't exhibit things that aren't present. So like you may not talk very much, you might be more mute when you're schizophrenic. You might have a blunted effect, so like very lethargic, very rigid, not really just not there, basically. That's about the easiest way I can say that. I wish I could say it in a better way, but the last thing I want to talk about are personality disorders. There's a lot. There's 3 different clusters. There's cluster A, B, and C. And when it comes to these, in cluster A, these disorders are characterized by odd or eccentric behaviors. So in this one, you have paranoid personality disorder. You also have schizoid personality disorder and schizotypal personality disorder. I just talked about schizophrenia, and I just mentioned schizoid and schizotypal. Schizoid and schizotypal personality disorders, they have characteristics of schizophrenia. They're not full-blown schizophrenic, but they do have characteristics of it, like schizoid, for example. Schizoid personality disorder, you're social isolated, emotionally cold, and indifferent to others. Whereas schizotypal, you have very peculiar, very weird thoughts and behavior, and you have very poor interpersonal relationships. So they have some characteristics of schizophrenia, but it's not full-blown schizophrenic. You have cluster B, and this is more characterized by dramatic, emotional, and erratic behaviors. So you got antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic. I'm sure most of these you probably heard before. It's like antisocial. That's where you don't really conform with any of society's norms. You fail to conform to any of them. You don't have any kind of guilt or anxiety, and you're very irresponsible. Borderline personality disorder, that's where you have extreme changes in mood, your self-image. And with borderline personality disorder, you're very likely to show extreme outbursts of emotion, just like very like crazy behavior. You're likely to have outbursts just out of nowhere over the simplest things. Histrionic, that's where somebody's attention seeking. That's where they're very, very dramatic. They exaggerate their emotions and express those in a very exaggerated way. They can also be seductive and provocative. Excuse me. So histrionic, very dramatic, very emotional as far as their reaction to everything. Can also be very seductive and provocative, and also basically comes down to attention seeking. So you've got that. You also have narcissistic personality disorder. With that, you have a very exaggerated sense of self-importance. You have a very exaggerated sense of self. You find yourself super important and just grand whenever you really shouldn't. You exploit behavior of other people, and you lack empathy. So that's cluster B, where it's more dramatic and emotionally driven disorders. The last one is group C, or cluster C, I should say. With cluster C, it's characterized by anxious or fearful behavior. So you have avoidant personality disorder, where you avoid any kind of social interaction. You have a big fear of rejection and humiliation. Dependent personality disorder, that's where you have excessive dependence on others. You have an inability to assume your responsibilities. And then obsessive compulsive, we talked about that already, so I'm not going to go over that, but that's in cluster C. So you've got clusters A, B, and C. When it comes to these, like which ones are most well known, definitely cluster B, the ones that are more dramatic and emotional. Like I said, antisocial, borderline, histrionic, narcissistic. Those are the ones we are most likely to see whenever it comes to those types of personality disorders. But I'm going to stop it there, guys. So I'll talk to you later.